To me, having photography to do something like that, it's kind of a way in which one can evoke wonder. And I think wonder is one of the least exercise things that we do these days. We're so inundated with whatever, social media and everything, that oftentimes we miss what is right in front of us or around us and not see the capacity for it to transcend the mundane, to take the ordinary and move it to the extraordinary.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Derek Fassbender.
Welcome, listeners. I'm Derek Fassbender, host of the B&H Photography Podcast.
And I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast's senior creative producer.
And I'm Mike Weinstein, the show's technical producer and audio engineer.
Industrial expansion has left an indelible mark on our natural world, fundamentally altering landscapes and ecosystems for the sake of material progress and modern convenience. This transformation has created an environmental challenge of unprecedented scale. On today's show, we'll connect the dots between the raw materials that make up our planet and the industrial forces altering our contemporary landscape in a chat with a photographer who's documented these profound global changes firsthand. But before we begin, here's a bit more about our illustrious guest. Edward Burtynsky has spent more than 40 years bearing witness to the impact of human industry on our planet. Regarded as one of the world's most accomplished contemporary photographers, Burtynsky's work is included in the collections of more than 80 museums worldwide and featured in major exhibitions around the globe. Born in St. Catharines, Ontario in 1955, Burtynsky's early exposure to a nearby General Motors plant and ships navigating the Welland Canal in his hometown captured his imagination, helping to formulate his ideas about the scale of human creation he would later capture in photographs. These images explore the collective impact we as a species have on the surface of this planet. A select list of Burtynsky's many distinctions include the inaugural TED Prize, the title of Officer of the Order of Canada, the International Center of Photography's Infinity Award for Art, a Royal Photographic Society Honorary Fellowship, and the World Photography Organization's Outstanding Contribution to Photography Award. Burtynsky currently holds 9 honorary doctorate degrees, and in addition to his work in photography, he was a key production figure in the award-winning documentary film trilogy Manufactured Landscapes, Watermark, and Anthropocene, The Human Epic. All 3 films continue to play in festivals around the world. Ed Burtynsky, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
It is great to have you on. We'll dive right in, Ed. Your earliest pictures are traditional large format landscapes shot on 4x5 sheet film, but instead of making classic calendar type views, your interests in painting and the abstract expressionists led you to apply aspects of that artistic style. Now, when composing with a large format camera, the image is presented upside down on the ground glass. Did that inversion of reality into an image that was flipped on its head help you to think about your photographs based on abstract qualities?
Well, it's interesting. There's 2 things you do often when you compose. One, I was taught, is squint your eyes. And when you squint your eyes to the point where you get blocks of color, light and dark, and all of a sudden everything becomes these kinds of shapes. And then you can kind of begin to make your composition or think about composition that way. When you're looking at 4x5, it's not just upside down, but the image is really dim too. You have to even, open up wide open, and those large format lenses traditionally aren't that fast. Some of them are even only 5.6. So, you don't get a lot of light to work with, and it's upside down. So it is something I find very magical as well when you're under the ground glass. And it, I think, also helps compositionally, that if it kind of works upside down, it really somehow even gets better when it's flipped the other way around. And that large format as well, because back then, shooting 4x5, and I was a student, it's not cheap. For every shot you do, you have to really think about it. So by the process, by the contemplative approach, you end up really being considered about what it is that you're putting on the frame and the light and the film that you're using to make sure that it captures light and the exposure and making sure that that all works. So it's almost like a ritualistic kind of procedure that you begin to develop if you're working in large format. That also for me was what I found rich about it too, because any small move or any mistake, any weak link in the chain, and the image falls apart. So everything has to be on perfect level of the exposure, of the type of film, of the light you're shooting, and the lens that you're shooting with, and how you process that and how you expose that. And none of them can have a fail or the image has failed. So it was a really rigorous kind of learning by mistakes and by saying, oh, I went too fast and I made a mistake there. The shot's out of focus. In that corner, it doesn't work anymore. So it was a great kind of practice, I call it, in large format.
Hmm. And what is the learning curve like with that? I mean, with shooting from above, one of the dynamics that makes it really interesting yet difficult at the same time is that you don't know what you're seeing until you get up there, and you don't have unlimited time. So in talking about this contemplated approach, how do you really set yourself up and plan for what you may not see until you're up there, and then you kind of have to do everything on the fly?
Well, we have sort of an idea of what's up there. Thank you, Google Earth. A lot of times when I am doing stuff from the air, and I just came back from a trip shooting in Australia, is like mining. And so these sites are fairly evident if you go into Google Earth and scroll around, which is a lot easier than when I first started doing mines in 1981, 82. I actually had a minerals map of Canada and the United States and went to places where it says large deposits of copper over on this mountain. And I'd go to that mountain and say, is there a copper mine around here? Because there was nothing that was a visual indicator of what was where. So you kind of went to where you think the materials were and then who was harvesting those materials. And then you try to find a way to get into those mines. So the world has moved a lot from when I first started to what I am doing today. But, I have a pretty good path that I'm going to tell the pilot to go on. If I know where I'm going, like I just did the big shoot in the DRC, and I didn't really have any helicopter cover there. So everything was drone. So I'd use the small Mavic drone to go and search out a whole area because it can go for kilometers, and I'd be looking at what's out there. And then when we find something that's really interesting, then I'd get into the vehicle and we drive the bigger drone. We use Free Fly out of Seattle. And, we'd put together that drone and put my 100 megapixel camera on the drone. And then because it has a shorter range, I don't want it to be more than several thousand feet away from me. I want to still be able to see it. We have to be at least within 2,000 feet of the subject if I want to continue monitoring the drone and the subject. So that's a whole different way of working when I'm working from the air and I don't have helicopter cover. And then there's a third way I work too, which is just fixed wing aircraft, which is, again, you cover a lot of territory. You have to get your shutter speeds up pretty high. I usually work with something like a Cessna. You want to try and get one that doesn't have a strut and the wheels retract. There's a couple of older varieties that do that. And then you can also work with that, but you're moving at a pretty high rate. You're probably going at around 80 nautical miles an hour because slower than that, you hit stall speeds and you don't want to stall in the air. It's not a good idea. In practice, there's a lot of different ways. So what is interesting is that I'm trying to use the same approach that I learned in large format photography, which is that contemplative tripod, move it a couple inches this way, that way, a little higher. Oh, that's it. Everything's fallen into place. I'm trying to have that same kind of almost feel and approach to image making, but I'm bouncing around in a helicopter, always moving at speeds. Drones are a little bit better for that. I can lock a drone in space and just move it around a couple of degrees one way or another. And it's more like that ability to compose as you would with almost like a tripod. But if you're in an aircraft, you're moving and you don't really get a second chance to be in the exact same spot. So even when the pilot comes around again, it's never exactly where you want. So there's a lot more overshooting to try and make sure that the one that you want feels like everything is just dropped into place as it would as if I was using a tripod 800 feet or 1,000 feet.
Mm-hmm. Now, the decision between fixed wing, helicopter, drone, is that dictated strictly by the landscape and what you can get up? Or when you have a preference, what do you prefer?
If there's a lot of material in a small area, I prefer a drone. If there's stuff that I need to explore over a vast terrain, I prefer a helicopter. Even something like a Robertson 44 with the door off, because I never shoot through the plexi. I'm always shooting with door off or with opened window or whatever, whether it's the phase lens or I'm doing a lot these days with the Fuji camera, putting out lens through plexi is like degrading the lens to a cheap versus the lens that you want. So if you want that quality, when you're standing in front of a print that's a 60 by 80 inch print, you don't want to be putting that through any plexi or anything. So I shoot open air all the time from these aircraft, but I do have harnesses and I strap my cameras in and everything is strapped down when I'm flying around with the door off.
Okay. Now, your pictures are also known for a compressed sense of space, which is another element that helps abstract the reality. Can you talk about your approach to taking a 3D landscape and the perspective and depth of field that come with it and translating that into the flat plane of an image?
Well, it's interesting because at first, when I fell into photographing with a 4x5 camera, I just wanted a willing subject that was sitting there and didn't move around too much, and I could kind of slowly approach and figure it out. And so, to me, it was like landscape, and I went after things like really, really dense kind of shrubbery. And back in my mind, I was thinking like Jackson Pollock, Dubuffet, but I want to do it in the world of photography. The visual and the visual arts that I was pursuing in the medium was to have images that were highly complex. I kind of always saw photography's one of its greatest strengths is its ability to render detail on a level that if you're a hyper-realist painter, to get that kind of detail, you'd have to sit in front of a painting for a year, slowly painting every square inch of it into that detail. Whereas, 4x5 or an 8x10, bang, you've got high resolution detail, hyper detail in a way that we don't see the world ourselves. I mean, that's what I actually fell in love with. I understood that when we're in the world with the way we see, we have maybe 200 degrees of vision and with periphery included. And there's only like 8 degrees of that is actually sharp. And that's when we read. There's a part of our retina that has the highest density of rods and cones. And that's where we pick up our detail in that 8%. But the rest of it kind of starts to fall off pretty quickly. Whereas when you get a super high resolution picture, you're seeing all of it at once in that hyper sharp way. And I kind of understood that, very early on in photography, and I really fell in love with it. So when I started to compose, I composed like a painter would think of the whole canvas. I was going corner to corner, top to bottom. Everything had to work. Everything had to fall into place. The color, the texture, the light, the density, the flattening out, the all overness, and all of that. So when I went out and I did landscapes, I was not just trying to do calendar pictures. I was trying to do Jackson Pollock's out in the forest. And that's where I kind of did my training, like learning your scales. As a musician, I was learning my scales out there in that complex environment where you're walking and everything is just chaos. If you've walked in the forest, you realize it's one of the most complex, dense areas of information, very different than walking down the street where you got pavement, bricks, glass. All these surfaces are very readable and very understandable very quickly. Whereas here, in that complex matrix, I would find that, if I just go over here and attenuate my eye, the whole thing snaps together and it's really interesting. And it's way more interesting than a foot in either direction. So it was kind of that dialing in of your eye and your ability to navigate chaos to the point where, and then just hiving out that one little area that all of a sudden everything snaps together. And I think that training that I did in 4x5 really allowed me then to go into do the same thing to oil refineries, do the same thing to factories, do the same thing to recycling yards or wherever. I think that ability to navigate chaos and then, find the organizing principles of that particular subject and then find the spot where the light, the color, the structure and everything all of a sudden comes together.
I love that term, navigating chaos. It's like, as you're describing this, I'm thinking about all the times I've looked out of an airplane and I'm trying to make sense of what's below. Is there like an ideal height? I mean, as you're rising up, for anybody who's ever flown a drone or shot from a helicopter, the higher you get, the elevation, obviously the landscape changes and you start to lose detail and it starts to become a whole different scene. Is there a sweet spot that you hit as far as elevation is concerned where you see differently?
Depending on what the subject is and how I want it. Generally speaking, I've always liked a more slightly wide angle lens view versus going in with a telephoto from a helicopter. And the telephoto from a helicopter which happens a lot. But I don't want it to go down the kind of patterny world where it's just formalist and you find the patterns and repetitions and you zoom in on them and visually they're interesting. I want to actually always have a little bit more information that speaks to scale. So if there's a truck in there, like a pickup truck, and then you can recognize that pickup truck on the print, or there's something there that all of a sudden you get the sense of, what that building might be, that size of that building is, or you might know the size of what that roadway is with a car on it or whatever. And that all of a sudden unpacks the scale of the thing that I'm photographing. Because largely, most of my work has looked at human altered landscapes, and in particular, industrial human altered landscapes, mining, quarries, forestry, and salt pans and salt harvesting. Those are really a lot of the subjects that I've been looking at. So to me, it's always interesting to have a little piece of human scale that then is your key to unlocking the rest of the picture. Then all of a sudden it all begins to fall into place. And to me, that's kind of neat, because oftentimes you'll walk up to, what I'm trying to do in my images, you don't even know it's a picture. Like the pivot irrigation work, you don't even know it's a picture. You kind of look at it and say, is this drawing? What is this? And then you kind of start looking at it more closely. And then all of a sudden in the bottom left corner, there's a farm and there's a roof and there's a tractor. And then all of a sudden you go look at the whole thing again and say, oh, it is a picture. And to me, having photography to do something like that, it's kind of a way in which one can evoke wonder. And I think wonder is one of the least exercised things that we do these days. We're so inundated with whatever, social media and everything. Oftentimes we miss what is right in front of us or around us and not see the capacity for it to transcend the mundane, to take the ordinary and move it to the extraordinary. And to me, that's always a fun transition to work with. If you ever went to a mine, and people would say, I've been to mines and I've seen them. I can't imagine that there's a decent picture that you could take in the place that's been devastated by, blasting and machinery. But looked at it in a certain way, there is something there. And there is some way to look at it, to have this kind of extraordinary experience visually exploring something that we as humans do.
You talked about planning out, and obviously your work is meticulous in the planning and the research behind it. How often do you pivot? Whether it's up from above or underneath the ground in that mind sense, is it often that you get there and your kind of view or seeing things in front of you changes the way you want to approach it?
Absolutely. I mean, you go in there with your best laid plans, and then you have to change. I mean, almost all the time, you have to really be kind of ready to, move. And hopefully you've got the toolkit or the options that you need to have to make those decisions based on the circumstances that you're getting. And sometimes we're being restricted, saying, no, you can't go there, you can't do that. Or sometimes it's the weather, a sunny day, and this does not work under sun. I have to wait for other conditions. There's always on the ground field decisions that you're making all the time, and you're trying to maximize your time there. So say, okay, I love this, but it's going to look great in the morning. Let's log that in the morning. Let's make sure that we're over there at 7 a.m. with sunrise, because that'll look amazing. And then this doesn't matter. It's a flat space, no shadows. We can shoot this at high noon. So you're immediately looking at your options and your subject, and you're saying, how and when, and directing. Usually I'm working with several people, like driver and my field producer and then possibly somebody from the mine. So you're now coordinating all of them to be there and be ready to go for that particular window of light. It's usually we're chasing light and subject both times. So those are the things that are constantly causing us to pivot, move, reshape the day, design something that will yield the results that I want, given my experience. And I think that's where also, having worked in the field for 50 years, wow, a long time. You learn things. You don't have to make those mistakes again. That's why I say experience is great, because you don't have to make that mistake again. You've made it enough times to say, I don't need to do that. My chances are better over here than over there. There's that kind of years of knowing kind of what works and what doesn't work, and not having to waste time on something that won't yield the kind of thing you want. So I found over the decades, my batting average of coming back with what I want continues to be there, or sometimes even get better.
Mm. Now, you said it yourself, 50 years, a lot of experience there. And you've also seen and experienced yourself a lot of changes in technology. We've kind of touched upon the various types of gear and technology, but I kind of want to dive into that some more and talk about, you adapting to digital, adapting to drones, going from large format decades ago to now the ability that we have with drones where you're not just relying on a drone camera. You can put up a drone with an entire full size, $5,000-$10,000 camera up there and get images that you wouldn't even think possible 20, 30 years ago. Can you talk about how the technology, how the gear has shaped your process, what you've taken advantage of, and what has changed the way you shoot and the way you think?
I was doing a project in China. It was a water project I was working on, and I was trying to get a drone up in the air because there was no airspace. You couldn't hire a helicopter in China. There was no commercial aviation. It was either military or commercial flights for airlines. And I don't even think it's changed that much even since then. So airspace is very limited. In the Fujian province, I was doing a project on water, and I researched one of the biggest fish farm areas in the world was on the shores of this province. And I had gone there in, I think, 2010 and walked and boated around these areas. And it was like, 30,000 homes all bolted together, floating on this area where they all raised fish. They were raising different kinds of fish and shellfish. And I wanted to show it from the air, and I couldn't do it. So I started researching where I can get a drone to take my Hasselblad at the time so I can communicate with it and compose with it. So I met this guy, Tab Fischow, who started Freefly, and he had just developed his gimbal, which was the real invention that was really amazing. But he had it on a traditional kind of drone helicopter with a single blade and the rotor at the back. And I started working with him. So I had my Hasselblad on his drone in California, testing it in 2011. And we had got it successfully working. So we figured out how to get a little pencil camera pointing down onto the ground glass of the Hasselblad with a transmitter that would pick it up, and I can then look and compose and press shutter. I couldn't change my f-stops, but once my shutter speed and f-stop were locked off, I can then send it up. And for that duration, which is usually about 10 minutes with the batteries, I would have to shoot under that condition, but I was able to shoot and compose. So I had swing, tilt, shift on the gimbal. And then I took Tab with two of those kits to China to photograph these fish farms. That was really the beginning, but I was using that kind of a helicopter with my Hasselblad on it. As time progressed, then there was the 8-bladed drones that became far more stable. I've had Phase-on drones, I've had Hasselblad on drones, and more recently the Fuji 100 GS on drones. So, but as it's going along, it's getting better and better. Now I can control my f-stop and ASA and shutter speeds from the ground. I got way more control today than I ever did. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, almost 15 years of working with drones and large format digital cameras.
Well, this seems like a good time to take a short break, so let's stand up, stretch, shake it out, or if you're already standing, have a seat, relax, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Edward Burtynsky about his awe-inspiring industrial landscapes. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes on your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join our B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
And we're back with the contemporary master of industrial landscape photography, Edward Burtynsky. Now, during the break, Jill had an interesting question regarding the permission required to get into some of these places.
Ed, a little earlier on, you talked about the access you would have to mines and industrial sites with the various crew members that you would be working with. Can you talk a little bit about the access and how you've worked that out and how it's changed over time? Has it gotten easier given your notoriety, or has corporate red tape made it more difficult in recent years?
Depends. It's a bit of both. I mean, it seems there's less willingness, I guess. I don't know if people are running at a much leaner kind of staffing and expectation of output. I find that if I don't have the CEO, if the top dog of that operation doesn't have buy-in, it gets very difficult because nobody in the management area seems to have the kind of bandwidth to really sit and take care of you while you're on their properties. The helicopters bypass that altogether because they can't stop you because they don't own the airspace. So a helicopter is fine. Interesting, I can fly over with a helicopter, but I can't fly a drone over it. So there's different rules for that. Even if the drone operator has a license to drone operate in those areas, you can't fly the drone over, but you can fly a helicopter over. It's just the way the aviation rules work pretty much in all Western countries. It's always just in Australia. But if you go into China, that doesn't work either. Everything has to be approved in places like China. Access it's tricky and is getting trickier. I think people are more afraid of social media messaging and negative messaging. Usually I'm having conversations at a fairly high level with CEOs or members of boards on big minds. I'm usually having the conversation there. I don't bother having a conversation lower down because it's not going to work. And when you get that buy-in, then doors open up. And I've been very careful. I'm a bit of a realist in the world. I've seen a lot. I understand that we have an insatiable need for materials as a society. We like to think we're past that we're now a service economy, and 80% of our revenues and incomes come from service and only 20% in manufacturing. But all that manufacturing, as we all know, and what's happening in America right now, trying to bring some of that manufacturing back, and so much of it went to China, which is where I went 20 years ago to photograph where that all went. And I follow that globalization story, but it's not cut and dry when people say, "Oh, I should be showing these things as blights on the land. Why am I aestheticizing something that's a disaster?" And I point out that if you want to call that a disaster, then think of your own life. And you wake up in your cotton sheets with your feather pillow and hit your plastic alarm that's fed by electricity, probably from a nuclear power plant or a coal power plant with copper from there to your alarm clock. And then you turn on your faucet, which is nickel probably, or stainless steel that has copper pipes that take it from the water processing plant. I said, you are so connected to so much material and so much minerals. Are you saying that your life is a disaster because we're engaging with these materials every day of our lives? We sit in the subway. Well, that's all materials. Materials are an incredibly key part of modern society. And yet we need to go to sources in nature where these materials are found. And I'm just reconnecting a reality that we still live in a material world, and our cities are built of molecules that came from somewhere. And I'm just taking you to those places that are vast and huge. And so it's like I'm just a messenger, and I'm trying to show it in a way that isn't offensive to the mining industry. If it was offensive to the mining industry, or if I was card carrying environmental cease and desist kind of mining is a blight on the world, then that would be the end of me ever getting on the ground in any mine operation to do it. And I did have the life experience of working as a miner when I was putting myself through university. One of the best paid jobs was mining, and I went up north as a gold miner and went underground and worked as a gold miner for 6 months when I took a year off to try to build up enough revenue to buy a large format camera and film and all the materials to be able to work in the large format field. I needed quite a bit of resource as a student. My father died when I was 15, so there was no family support. I had to do it all myself. So I went to the places that paid well. And then I got to see those worlds, and then eventually went back to them to say, I don't think people understand these worlds. And I'd worked in them. And so maybe it would be interesting as an artist to try to take the skills I built as a photographer and have me and my experience growing up in these large industries to be a conduit of those worlds back into the urban worlds. So in many ways, that's the basis of my thesis, and is to really reconnect us with the material world in the places where it comes from in nature.
Mm-hmm. And you're presenting them in a heroic fashion. So I'm assuming that that's part of your pitch when you're looking for access, is to help the CEOs appreciate the fact that you're wanting to present them as a heroic statue.
I'm not sure that's the perfect word, but it's almost like abstracting that. In many ways, it's a metaphor of mining. Because if you look at almost any mine, let's say a copper mine, like a very, very rich copper mine is like 5% of the ore that they blast is actually copper. That's a really, really good average copper mine. Most copper mines, like the ones in Chile that have been going for a long time, you're getting about 1% of the ore that they're digging up is actually copper that they can use. You can pick up a rock from a copper mine and look at it in your hand, and you don't see any copper. You don't even know it's got anything. You have to actually pulverize it and then put it through all kinds of tests and assays and find out if there's anything valuable in there. To me, it's that journey of the ordinary to the extraordinary. Most mining are just rocks. And when I go to these mines as a visual artist, most of it is unphotographable. It's not interesting. But once in a while, there's something that goes, oh, that's really interesting, or I really like that. So I'm just trying to mine the mines visually, and they're mining the rock through assays and through core sampling. So it is kind of an apt metaphor. I'm not there as a documentary photographer. Here's a blast, and then it goes by train over to here, and this is where it gets crushed. I'm not doing a documentary project. I'm doing an art project. I'm using these mines as a sculptor would use a lump of clay. I'm forming it into something. Again, using that attenuated way of looking at the world, I'm going to form it into something that actually visually has this kind of cohesion to it and has a kind of a sense of visual interest or wonder that makes one kind of stop and say, what is it? Why am I looking at this? Or what is this place? I've never seen anything like it. That narrative is there, but the narrative's not leading. It's in the subtext of it all.
So Ed, it's interesting. So you just mentioned that your early life, you worked as a miner to make money and knew about some of these places. But also in your biography, there is this moment in 1981 in Pennsylvania where it seems like you had some sort of epiphany because that photograph is very different from your earlier ones. Did you see something that you hadn't seen before in 1981 and maybe led you on a different trajectory moving forward?
It was an interesting moment because actually I took a wrong turn on a highway in Pennsylvania and I started heading east and I was supposed to be heading west. I was heading north up from Virginia, and I had done Roanoke and the Blue Ridge Parkway, and I was going up along the eastern seaboard. And I got into Pennsylvania, and I found myself maybe like 30 minutes on the wrong highway in the wrong direction. And I thought, okay, I'm going to cut back through this road, which took me through this little town called Frackville. And I was doing mostly that compressed kind of landscape, the high density. And I was there largely in the spring because I don't want leaves yet. I just want the understructure of thick brush and trees and all that. But then I ended up in this town called Frackville, which is nearby Centerville, which had that underground coal fire as well, which was kind of fascinating. As the town was kind of smoldering from below because once coal catches fire underground, there's enough oxygen to keep it going, so to speak. So that fire had been already burning for almost a decade or more at that point, underground fire. But in Frackville, I got out of my car and they were doing this surface mining of a seam that went for quite some distance. I'd never seen seam coal mining. And there was a lot of, I guess, overburden or stuff that didn't have any value that they had to pile up. And these piles had been piled up decades ago, and there was these birches that were punching through these man-made piles. And I just started photographing, being kind of offside to what I was looking at. And actually, at the time, didn't think that much of it. I thought, it was different. It's something that I found visually interesting, and I just captured it. But it was that winter, because I was at that time printing all my pictures by drum in my basement. I printed out all the ones I wanted of the landscapes, and then I was going through my contacts, and I came across these again. And I started printing them up. And it was actually that winter when I started printing those is where I basically had the epiphany. I was thinking, okay, this is really interesting. This has another dimension to it. These altered landscapes are really only going to become more plentiful because I was thinking of the population growth that everybody at that time was talking about, that we're moving to 10 billion people. And when I was born, it was like 2.8 billion. So I'm thinking, well, this is only going to get more and more intense as we increase in population. And so I kind of put those ideas together thinking, this is more the landscape of my time, the harvesting of nature for that human population growth will become an important story. And I felt the confidence at 1981 that that was a big enough idea to spend the rest of my life expressing it. Basically, from that point on, every picture I've taken is either about nature itself, going back to that original tuning of my eye. And I like to go back to that once in a while, or the industrial world that we built from the materials that we harvest. So it is one continuous body of work that's never altered from that original inception moment in 1981.
Ed, I want to pivot a little bit here. You've had success in other photo-related business ventures, particularly Toronto Image Works that you established back in the mid-'80s. And you described this business as a ballast that could provide you with income by printing for other photographers while you were still pursuing your own fine art projects. How was this received by the local arts community initially? Was there a lot of support behind it? And ultimately, how did that change your trajectory as an artist as a whole?
Yeah, interesting moment in my life. So going back to what I just said, I was doing drum processing of my prints in 81, 82. And I was talking to my friends who had graduated from university as well and handed back our cage cards that had a 30-inch processor that we could use. So I was used to a processor where you can do an addition of 4 of the same. And as long as I expose and burn and dodge them each the same, I'm going to have 4 exactly the same prints or very close. Try and do that on a drum processor, and it's a whole day to make 4 prints. By the time you dry the drum, do another one. And then by the 4th one, the room you're working in's gotten warmer, things have changed. I don't have it exactly the same, so they don't really match side by side. So it was driving me crazy. And then I looked around and I wanted to be an artist. I didn't want to be a camera for hire. I just wanted to be a camera for my own vision, for my own ideas, not to mix it up. And I did try for a while doing architectural photography, and in the early 80s, if anybody of you were around, there was a bad recession and all the architects were barely keeping their doors open. So nobody was hiring photographers to photograph their projects. So that didn't work. So I was getting grants at the time as an artist, but then I went around and talked to all my friends and I said, hey, maybe we can do a co-op and get a processor. Then we can all have a processor and we can have it in some industrial space and we all pitch in. And I looked at that for a while and there was interest, and I had a half a dozen colleagues that thought they would do it. And then I thought about it and I thought, it's not going to work because inevitably they're not going to be using it all the time. And then one person's going to have to take care of it. And who's going to buy the chemistry? I just thought it's just going to be a kind of a slow death of who did what and why isn't it working. And then I thought, well, maybe it could be a business. And then in 83, I went on a big tour of North America. Any city that had darkroom rentals, I went in and I had them process some of my 4x5 film. I did some prints and I basically took their brochures, looked at their pricing, talked to the owners, said, I'm thinking of doing this in Toronto. And eventually found a guy in Buffalo who had really evolved it probably to the furthest I've ever seen anybody do a darkroom rental. And we did talk about partnering, but that kind of fell apart. But I took all those ideas and said, I'm going to build an amazing state-of-the-art darkrooms incorporating all the best of everything I saw in all these 10 places, because I printed in all these places and saw what was wrong with them. And somebody walked by and the enlarger started shaking and had to throw that sheet of paper away. And I realized all these things have to be considered, and dust and a place to blow it. And each table had a light box and the enlarger was independent of the walls. So if somebody slammed the door, it's not going to shake. It took every possible thing. You walk out into a dark corridor with your paper, feed it right into the machine, but there's enough light there that you can navigate it. So all these kind of questions I answered, and then went out to raise money. And like, I'd never owned a business, nor had I ever worked a day in a lab in my life, but I knew about the process. And I put together a 230-page business plan with the best, worst, and most likely scenario of the outcomes of me opening this up. And lo and behold, I was able to find enough investors. I kind of basically said, what's the perfect lab and how much would it cost? And I realized at that time it cost $250,000. This is 1983. So I went out and said, I need $250,000 to business people because I want to build this lab. And there was enough people that believed in me that, I was able to raise that money. And I started the darkroom rental in 1985. which is still running as a lab. We now have, I think there's over 20 people. I just merged with another company, and we're probably one of the biggest labs in Toronto right now. So that's 40 years later. But what it did do for me was it allowed me not to have to be the camera for hire, because the two places where most photo artists went to make their way to create their art was either they became commercial on some level, whether it's for advertising or product photography or fashion or something, and then try to make their own work, or they taught and try to make their own work. And in both cases, I saw more failures and successes where if you went commercial, that commercial overrode your creative spark that made what you did as an artist, kind of diluted it. Teaching had a better chance because you got summers off often and you'd have that window to actually create work. But I also found that a lot of teachers who had artistic aspirations early in their careers didn't follow it. Whereas I thought with opening a lab, I would get really good at printing. So I'd become a much better printer because I'm printing as a custom lab, because we were a custom lab and we processed C41. So it was really out of self-interest to keep at the very forefront of lenses, enlargers, processors, chemistries, all the things that it takes to make great prints. I would be at the forefront of all of this. And the second thing it taught me was when you open a company, it's very humbling. You're in the service of others. You're trying to make them happy. You're trying to win their business, and you're taking a lot of trust. Back then, we were doing E6 and C41. You take somebody's 100 rolls from a trip around the world or something, and you process it and you screw it up. That's a very difficult conversation with the person that you just messed up. So you don't want those mess ups. So you have to be very disciplined. And you have to keep all these machines running with a super high spec, and you have to be super clean and have to have super trained staff and all that. So it did teach me discipline, and it did teach me perfection. Errors are not an option. You have to get it right, and you have to get it right every time. And so when I applied that kind of rigor, I also applied it to my art. And so when I worked with dealers, I built software that allowed them to see what was available, how much they were, what sizes did they come in, what editions were they, making sure that once they place an order, they get it within a prescribed time, perfect every time, so they don't have to send it back. And I recognize that to be an artist, it's an entrepreneurial thing. Yeah, you can sit and work and create, but at the same time, if you're going to make a living at it, you're going to have to deliver these things, and you're going to have to deliver them in a way that is beneficial to the person. So when they're going and they have 30 artists in their drawers and they have a client, when they're looking at all those artists, are they going to pull your drawer and say, here, take a look at this guy's work? I always thought that if I was really good and, not only in the work, that the work was good, but also that the delivery of all that they need for them to be a successful gallery and to get their clients satisfied, gave me a kind of a better chance of success to have dealers around the world who would be confident in selling my work to potential clients. So I think that training that I developed in starting Toronto ImageWorks was very, very complementary to my work as an artist as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. And we've barely scratched the surface. There's such a storied career, and the impact even more far-reaching than your incredible body of work. And now you have a retrospective exhibition, The Great Acceleration, that will be on view at the International Center of Photography in New York through September 28th. We've talked about the last 50 years, the technology, how your workflow has changed, what's stayed the same. What does the future hold for you? I mean, technology keeps doing its thing. And over your career, you've seen even the conditions that you're documenting accelerate vastly with that technology and the changes environmentally. What does the future hold for you, for us as a society?
It's interesting because that is a very big question. And I think one of the things that anybody who's paying attention right now, especially in the field of visual arts, AI has all of a sudden arrived. The interesting question that it brings to me is you can kind of appear as a photographic artist, never having picked up a camera. You can just prompt your way into, I'm working in what looks like photography, but it's AI. And, I remember pondering this, like even when DALL-E and some of the other programs were just hitting the market. And I was, wondering, does somebody who's never picked up a camera, never taken an art course, never really expressed in a way an interest in being an artist. And all of a sudden, by coming up with some clever prompts, you can get something that looks like art, something that somebody might have taken years to hone that kind of craft, that kind of approach, that kind of style, that palette, whatever it is that distinguishes that artist. And all of a sudden, through prompting, you can get there. That raises a lot of questions. And I'm trying to grapple with it myself. And I mean, the exhibition, The Great Acceleration, is really something that David Campany, the curator, and no curator had ever done this before. He went all the way back, pre the 1981 work that I did. He went to the 1979-80 work and is including some of that. And he basically wanted to draw a line from the fact that in my second year university, I was already on that trajectory of following that great acceleration. That early work was looking at agriculture because I immediately understood the way in which we have reshaped the planet more than any other way, whether it's mining, quarries, cities, whatever. Just to give you a quick example, if you look at all arable land in the United States of America and said, how much of that is urban? It's like 1%. You ask yourself, how much of that is agriculture? 30%. So that just gives you a kind of perspective. So I was looking at industrial agriculture back then. So that's even including that. And then looking all the way to my most recent work. So the Great Acceleration is now a term used by scientists and other people in the field of planetary monitoring. And the Great Acceleration is referred to really, it starts right after World War II. You see this massive acceleration in manufacturing, and the 50s was the beginning of the consumer society, whereas it wasn't that before. People had what they had, but life wasn't running around buying stuff. That consumer society was again, one of the early indicators of the Great Acceleration. In an interesting way, I'm also taking it all the way to AI. I was thinking, well, I'm not going to become myself an AI artist. I mean, I don't think that's something that I want to sit down and learn from scratch. That's for another generation. But I did find somebody in that other generation. There's a gallery that's just open called Heft, and his name's Elkan. And I saw his work in Perry Photo last year, and I thought it was really interesting. I thought, if I was an AI artist, I would do work like this. And it was like trying to project the world into the future. The owner of the gallery said, well, interestingly, he cites you as inspiration for his work. And I went, oh, really? And then he showed me a whole book of it. And I went, oh. And so it started a conversation. So I started talking to him. So now we're collaborating with him, and I'm helping shape where he's going with it. And it's almost like me projecting my work 100 years forward into a manufactured world that's almost beyond the imagination.
Wow.
And I'm doing all this printing here in Toronto at Toronto Imageworks because I found the one thing that I wasn't crazy about on the prints on the walls I saw in Perry Photo was the quality of his print. So I said, hey, you work with me and we'll start getting files that will look like my quality work on the walls at 60 by 80. So we just showed our first one about a month ago. And we sold it as a one of one. And we're doing a big exhibition in September of about 11 of these one-offs, one of one. So we're making it very kind of rarefied prints where there are collaborations between myself and this AI artist. And they're fascinating. They're looking at a future world through this kind of uncanny valley of, is this possible? And the scale that he's working with is the kind of, as I said, if I could find a place in the world that looked like that, I would photograph it. But now he's finding those places in AI. So I'm saying, well, let's make some great prints out of them and work together. So I'm shaping him too. I'm saying, go this way. This feel, this look is more interesting than what you're doing over here. And so we are truly collaborating on this next body of work with AI. And we're going to be doing a talk at ICP with myself and Adam and Elkan and David Campany, the curator, about photography and AI and what the future looks like. But it's anybody's guess. It's moving so fast. But I've always kind of been curious about technology, and I never shy away from it because I'm a believer that once it's here, it's sort of invented, and we don't uninvent things as humans. We go forward with them, and for good or for bad, they're here to stay, I think. And either they get taken up and get used, or they don't actually get taken up and fall away. I mean, there's a certain part where I thought, oh, VR was going to be it. And it's interesting how even Meta, after spending $5-10 billion, because he thought that VR was going to be something in the future, it didn't get take up, right? The gamers took it up, but it didn't really go past that very much. So Maybe the time's too soon, the form factor's wrong, whatever, but these things are here, they're invented, but they're not being adopted. Even Apple's VR set didn't quite go where they thought it was going to go. So technology is interesting, but AI, unlike anything else, is interesting because it's starting to really look and feel like high quality photography without a camera. It's just
Ed, you read my mind. I was so curious to see what your thoughts were on AI. And I'm like, there, we threw out a very general question and you took me right to it. So I got my answer. But that sounds fascinating. And that symbiotic relationship with you and Elkan, I clearly need to stop watching Black Mirror and get my idea of the future from that Edward Burtynsky Elkan collaboration. That sounds wonderful. Again, we did mention the exhibition, The Great Acceleration, on view at ICP in New York through September 28th. So I'll just mention that again. Ed, where can our listeners learn more about your work and follow along?
I have a website, which is usually pretty comprehensive. And then on the website, there is a place if you want to sign up for my newsletter. And so usually once every 2 months, I update it and send it to people's inboxes. And it basically says if I'm doing a talk somewhere or a new show is happening somewhere or a screening is happening. So all the things around my work are there in those newsletters. So if you're interested in what I'm doing and I'm going about doing it, that's a good place to start with my website.
Great. And that will be in our show notes.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Well, Ed, want to thank you. It was such a pleasure to have you on the program today. So we can't thank you enough.
No, my pleasure. And B&H has been a place that I've always visited as a photographer. And I used to love going in there and picking out a lens and bringing it home and making some great pictures with it. So you guys have been kind of a stalwart photo supplier for New York for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, 50 years.
Yeah.
The same amount of time.
And I was going into B&H in the 80s, even the late 70s, I was going there when I was at university. Yeah, it's been around for a long time. So it's an important store for the photographic industry.
There we go. We're excited and glad we could help facilitate such a wonderful career and, again, such impactful work. Huge thank you to Edward for joining us today, and for all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us today. If you are a fan of the show but are not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast Group, where you can share your favorite photos and comment about the show. I'm your host, Derek Fosbender. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of us all, thank you so much for tuning in today.